The phone rang, no threats. No shouting, no confession. Just a connection. Two voices meeting briefly in the dark of a late evening, then separating again, as if nothing had happened. If you were standing in the kitchen of that apartment, you wouldn't have felt the air change. You would have heard only the soft click of a receiver returning to its crossing, but that call didn't vanish. It went somewhere. And once it went somewhere, the family's life began to shrink, quietly, invisibly, until there was nothing left but a blank space where their names used to be. To understand how a phone call can destroy a family, you have to understand the era that made listening feel like survival. The Cold War wasn't only missiles and speeches. It was paranoia as a daily habit. It was the belief, shared by governments on every side, that danger could be hiding in routine, that enemies could look like neighbors, that sabotage could wear the face of someone buying brie in that world. Privacy wasn't a right. It was a privilege, and privileges can be revoked without warning. This story is told in fragments, because that is what fear does. It breaks lives into fragments. Some details were erased, others intentionally blurred. So for the sake of telling it clearly, we'll call them the Morozovs. A father, a mother, and two children living in an ordinary apartment in an ordinary city. The kind of building where every stairwell looks the same, where winter stains the window. The father worked a technical job. Not an important title, not a position that made him powerful. The kind of work that keeps systems running. Repairs, calibrations, paperwork, small decisions that never appear in newspapers. The mother held the household together. She knew the rhythms of the neighborhood, which shops ran out first, which days felt safest to go out with children. Their kids were school-aged, old enough to sense when adults were tense, too young to understand why. They weren't political people. They didn't attend meetings. They didn't carry slogans in their pockets. They wanted stability, and stability in the Cold War was something you earned by appearing normal. And then, on a quiet night, the father made a call. It was, in his mind, the most boring kind of call. Something about parts, spare components for a machine. Not contraband, not a weapon. Just something scarce, something inconveniently difficult to find. A colleague at work had scribbled down a phone number and suggested it might lead to help. Scarcity has a way of creating informal networks, and informal networks have a way of looking suspicious to people who believe every problem hides a conspiracy. The father dialed. The line rang. Someone answered. The conversation lasted seconds. There was confusion. There was an abrupt end. The father hung up, slightly annoyed, and returned to his evening. If you asked him later, he might not even remember the exact words. That's the cruel detail. The moment that destroys a life often feels too small to be remembered. But somewhere beyond his apartment, inside the infrastructure that carried his voice, someone did remember. In certain neighborhoods, in certain buildings, the telephone lines were considered sensitive. Not because of who lived there now, but because of who once lived there, who once visited. What suspicion had once touched that address? In a world built on files and patterns, an old stain can never be truly cleaned. The building stays flagged. The line stays interesting. The listening continues long after the original reason is gone. So when the father said the word parts, it landed in a room where people were trained to hear codes. Trained to see routine as camouflage. Trained to believe that innocent people don't need unusual phone numbers. The system didn't need proof. It needed a story. And the story began with a folder. A clerk opens a new file. A name goes on top. An address. A note. Outgoing call. Unusual phrasing. Abrupt termination. One page becomes two. Two becomes 10. A family becomes a subject. And once you are a subject, everything you do becomes material. The family didn't know a file had been created. They didn't hear the scratch of a pen, the click of a stamp, the quiet satisfaction of bureaucracy turning human life into paperwork. They only felt the after effects. At first it was the air, subtle, almost imaginary. A man who seemed to be waiting outside the building too often. A neighbor who stopped making eye contact. A conversation in a stairwell that died the moment the mother stepped into view. Small things, the kind of small things people dismiss, because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging a threat they can't control. Then the questions started appearing in places that should have felt safe. A teacher asking the children what their father does for work. Another adult requesting information with the tone of casual curiosity, but with eyes that measured every reaction. The children came home unsettled, unsure why ordinary details suddenly mattered. The mother told herself it was routine. The father told himself it would pass. Both of them were practicing a survival instinct as old as fear. Denial. Because denial allows you to sleep. But the Cold War had a particular talent for turning denial into a trap. Because the system doesn't need you to believe you're being watched. It only needs you to behave as if you might be guilty. A week after the call, the phone rang again. No one spoke to threaten them. No one demanded money. No one shouted accusations. It was polite, almost boring. Someone confirming names and details, as if handling a delivery that never existed. The mother answered because refusing to answer feels dangerous in a society where refusal is interpreted as guilt. She confirmed the name. She confirmed the address. She hung up. There was no package, but the system had learned something it wanted. The family responded not long after. There was a knock at the door. The kind of knock that sounds official even before you open it. Two men entered. They weren't wearing uniforms. They didn't need to. Their authority was in their posture, in the way they moved through the apartment as if the space belonged to them. Their questions arrived in a calm sequence. Work, colleagues, relatives, travel, contacts, habits. The father tried to answer with harmless facts. The mother tried to keep her voice steady. Then the men brought up that that's when the fat but suspicious of the men left after reminding the family, gently, that cooperation makes things easier. That sentence, so soft, so reasonable, was a warning after that was the second lesson. Fear doesn't only target individuals. It reshapes entire communities into silence. And then came the father was asked to come in for an interview. Not an arrest, not a trial, a conversation, the kind of word that implies fairness. He sat in a sterile room, facing a desk, and listened to his own life being read back to him as evidence. The call was typed out. The phrase, parts, sat on paper like a confession. The system offered him a statement to sign, carefully worded, vague enough to be used later, sharp enough to cut him if needed. The statement didn't say he was guilty. It said his actions could be interpreted as harmful. That single idea, interpretation, was the key. It meant guilt was a perspective, and perspective belonged to power. He signed because he wanted to go home. Because he wanted his children to stay safe. Because he believed signing might close the file. But the file doesn't close when you sign. It expands. Over the following weeks, the system returned in friendlier forms. A meeting offered like an invitation. A conversation framed like help. A request described as a chance to prove loyalty. The father was asked, subtly at first, to observe others, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who seemed dissatisfied. He was asked to listen for complaints, for jokes, for bitterness. It was presented as harmless. It was not. This was the moment the family truly began to break. Not from punishment, but from corruption. Because the most effective control doesn't imprison you. It recruits you. The father went home carrying a new kind of weight. He wasn't just afraid anymore. He was trapped between fear and shame. The mother sensed it. The children sensed it. There were arguments whispered behind closed doors. Not loud enough for neighbors, but loud enough to echo in the mind. The mother wanted to run. The father knew running would be framed as guilt. In systems built on suspicion, movement itself becomes evidence. So they stayed, and staying became its own form of surrender. At some point, the father did something desperate. He cut the phone cord. An attempt to reclaim control. A symbolic refusal to let the line be a leash. But by then, the phone was no longer necessary. The system didn't need the wire. It had the family's pattern. Their fear, their compliance, their file. A month after the call, maybe two, the pressure shifted. Something happened at the father's workplace. Missing equipment, rumors, panic. In such moments, systems look for easy answers, and easy answers come from people already marked. The father was summoned again. This time the tone was colder. The request became a demand. He was offered a new statement, stronger than the last, and a path that was essentially a contract. Cooperate fully and your family will be left in peace. Peace, in this world, meant a leash with slack. The father hesitated. The system gave him a deadline. Fear loves deadlines because deadlines shrink the mind. They turn moral questions into survival math. For 2 nights the family barely slept. The mother packed a bag. Not to escape, but to feel less helpless. The children watched and learned that safety could be revoked at any time. Then, on a night with no warning, the boots returned to the stairwell. The knock was not polite. The men entered without pretending. Drawers opened, books were lifted, mattresses checked. The apartment, once a private world, was handled like property. The mother asked where they were taking them. No answer. The children were told to put on coats. The older child tried to be brave. The younger clung to fabric and cried quietly. Neighbors stayed behind closed doors. In a frightened building, silence is not the absence of cruelty. It is participation. The family was taken down the stairs and placed into an unmarked vehicle. The door closed. The city lights slid across the windows like passing ghosts. What happened next is where the story becomes difficult, because the system that did this also controlled the record of what it did. The father was interrogated. The mother was interrogated. The children were separated efficiently, like paperwork being sorted. The questions repeated until fatigue created contradictions. Contradictions created accusations. Accusations created leverage. At some point, the father was given a pen again. And again he was offered the same bargain dressed in different words. Sign. Provide names. Become useful. And your family will be safe. This is the cruelest part of the Cold War machinery. It didn't only punish you. It asked you to participate in its hunger. It asked you to feed it other people so it would stop feeding on you. The father signed. Or perhaps he didn't. And the system wrote the signature for him. That happened too. Paper could be made to say anything once power decides it must. In the weeks that followed, the family did not return to their old life. Not fully, not cleanly. They returned to an apartment that felt contaminated. The phone cord was replaced. The line worked again, as if mocking them. The neighbors didn't greet them. The school watched the children differently. The father's workplace treated him like a stain. Then, one morning, the family was gone. The apartment was emptied fast. A new tenant arrived. The mailbox label changed. The names were removed from casual conversation as if they had never existed. People who had known them learned to forget them, because remembering was dangerous. Years later, after the Cold War eased and some archives cracked open, traces of the file surfaced. Not the full truth, not the clean narrative you want. Just fragments, dates, stamps, typed summaries that reduced human terror to administrative language. And the first entry, always the first, was the call. A simple phone call, a phrase interpreted as code, a number considered suspicious, a misunderstanding elevated into an accusation. In the end, that is the horror. The call didn't destroy them by itself. A voice on a line isn't powerful. The machinery around it is. The system that believed listening was safety. The bureaucracy that turned possibility into guilt. The community that learned silence as survival. When you live in a world where interpretation belongs to power, innocence is not protection. It's only another story someone can rewrite. And somewhere, whether in a basement office, a dusty archive, or a forgotten ledger, there is still a record of that call. 30 seconds. Less than a minute. Enough time to change everything. Because the most terrifying weapon of the Cold War wasn't a missile. It was the certainty, on both sides of the world, that someone was always listening.